Hi, I'm Plekra and welcome to my guide on how to play as a fresh level 80 bard. I have been maining bard since the end of Heavensward, so it's really the only job I feel confident enough to share my knowledge about. So yeah, this guide will focus on bard at level 80, I won't go over the leveling experience as bard because, well, it would take far too much time, especially since I expect this video to end up quite long to begin with. And if you're leveling bard in the first place, you're already getting familiar with bard's mechanics and learning as you go. I will assume you already have some kind of knowledge about the game, like some basic terminology specific to FF14 or MMOs in general, but if I bring up any word or acronyms specific to Bard, I will do my best to explain them. We will go over Bard's basics and level cap, as well as some of the more obscure mechanics that you as a Bard should know about. Now I know Endworker is only 4 months away at the time of recording this video, but I figured I'd still make one, considering that's plenty of time for new players who might be interested in the job to catch up on the content and learn the basics of Bard, which hopefully should remain the same going into the next expansion. Now that being said, let's get into it. Bard is one of the 3 physical ranged drops currently available alongside Machinist and Dancer, and well, just like the other 2, it can move around while attacking without losing damage of time. Unlike the other drops, however, Bard doesn't have a combo system where you have to, press certain skills in sequence, where you have to press 1, then 2, then 3, or 1, then 2, then 4. And instead, Bard skills have some sort of interaction with the rest of the kit, and they follow a priority system. Bard's job mechanic revolves around songs and damage over time effects, which work together by providing some new abilities in the form of RNG procs. So yeah, the job focuses very much on reactive gameplay with split-second decisions, and while it's not as RNG reliant as Dancer, a significant portion of your damage output will still come from random procs. Next, I want to talk about Bard's mechanics, so that's the song gauge, the soul voice gauge, as well as the dots since they're all tied together. The song gauge displays which song is currently active. So for instance, if I use Wanderer's Minuet, you can see the song gauge displaying Wanderer's UI. If I apply my dots and wait for them to tick, and whenever I use Ampere or Arrow, I get a Repair to effect, which is basically the fancy name for the song procs. And you can see that every time I get a proc, my soul voice gauge increases by 5. Now let's go over the way Bard dots work. Dots tick every 3 seconds in this game, and our dots each have a 40% chance of giving you a song proc. And since we have 2 dots, we actually have a 48% chance of getting 1 proc and a 16% chance of getting a double proc for each tick. That means we have a 64% chance of getting at least 1 proc every 3 seconds. Then let's talk about how dot damage works, which can be pretty counterintuitive, but very important to understand when you should and when you shouldn't refresh your dots, so please bear with me. Dots are generally split into 2 components: the initial hit, when your skill hits the target, and the actual damage over time component. The damage over time calculation is actually only done once, when your skill hits, and it stays the same for the duration of the dot. Each individual dot tick also has a chance to crit and direct hit, and both the damage and the crit/direct hit rate are calculated when a dot is applied and take into account all your damage buffs and debuffs, as well as the target's defensive buffs and debuffs. That's what we refer to as snapshotting, and it works the same for most dots in the game. If that sounded complicated, let me show you an easy example. So here, I'm putting up my unbuffed dots. If I use Raging Strikes, which is a plus 10% damage buff, my current dots will not benefit from it until I reapply my dots. If I refresh my dots at any point while Raging Strikes is up, my new set of dots will get the plus 10% damage buff for their entire duration, even if Raging Strikes falls off. And this also works with crit and direct hit buffs. Easy, right? That is why when you get a lot of raid buffs at once, such as in the opener, you will definitely want to snapshot them. I want to talk about Bard's priority system next and go over our GCDs so that first, you understand what they do, and second, you know when to use them. I'll be sorting the GCDs from the most important at the top and work my way down to the least important at the bottom. Stormbite and Caustic Bite are the 2 most important GCDs you almost always want to use first. Without dots, Bard is nothing. You are nothing. So make sure you put those up before anything else. Because Stormbite is stronger than Caustic Bite over time, we generally want to use Stormbite first and then apply Caustic Bite. Then we have Iron Jaws, which allows us to apply our 2 dots in 1 button press. You basically always want to use this whenever your dots are about to fall off, between 1 and 3 seconds left on the timer, or when you need to snapshot buffs. Try to avoid using IJ at the very last possible moment when you can see your dots dropping for a fraction of a second, because at best it doesn't do anything for you, and at worst you might waste a tick in the short time the dots were missing on the target. Next we have Apex Arrow, which deals more damage the more soul voice you have. It has 30 potency per 5 soul voice for a total of 600 potency at max charge. So basically, you always want to use it at 100 soul voice. It really shines in AoE situations where you have a lot of dots to apply to several targets, which can fill the gauge really fast, but in single target situations you should be able to use it at max charge roughly once every minute. Then we have Refulgent Arrow, which is a powerful GCD that you can only use under the effect of Straight Shot Ready. Every time you press a single target GCD, which means Storm Bite, Caustic Bite, Iron Jaws, or Burst Shot, you have a 35% chance of getting a Refulgent Arrow proc. And last, we have Burst Shot, which is our filler GCD that we press when we don't have to use any of the previous GCDs. Special mention to Quick Knock, which becomes worse using on 2 targets over Refulgent Arrow and Burst Shot. It also has a nice 30% chance of resetting the cooldown of Bloodletter and Rain of Death, which makes it the go-to GCD for AoE situations. So that covers the GCD part of the priority system. There are always some exceptions, but this will hold true for the majority of your raid encounters. Bard is very oGCD heavy in comparison to most other DPS jobs, but luckily the oGCDs are pretty straightforward for the most part, and they all interact with the core of our kit. Just like before, I'd be sorting them from the most important at the top to the least important at the bottom. First we have Wanderer's Minuet, which is our go-to song in single target situations. Procs in Wanderers give stacks of Pitch Perfect that you'll want to use when you reach 3 stacks, because the more stacks you have, the more damage it will do. Pitch Perfect CD is pretty low, but you pretty much always want to use it at 3 stacks instead of spamming it as soon as possible. Next is Mage's Ballad, and the song procs reset the cooldown of Bloodletter and Rain of Death. Bloodletter is a single target oGCD, whereas Rain of Death is the AoE version, so just use the one that suits the situation at hand. Army's Paean is generally considered the worst song to be in, but it's alright for AoE situations. What it does is, each song proc gives you up to 4 stacks of haste, which makes you attack faster by reducing your GCD and your auto attack timer. The downside is that any song proc you would have gained past the 4 stack is essentially wasted. When AP ends naturally after 30 seconds, you get Army's Ethos, which will be consumed when you use your next song for a lingering haste buff called Army's Muse. So basically when you go into your next song, usually you get Army's Muse, which is a haste buff, but if you don't have any other songs after AP, you gain Army's Ethos, which basically stores that haste buff for future use for your next song. An interesting property of these songs is that they are all treated as spells in-game, which means the cooldown of Mage's Ballad and Wanderer's Minuet are also affected by Army's Paean haste buff. Next is Bloodletter and Rain of Death. Bloodletter and Rain of Death share the same cooldown. If you use Bloodletter, Rain of Death also goes on cooldown. As a very general rule, we want to use BL over Imperial Arrow to try to avoid wasting a cooldown reset during mages. And speaking of which, Imperial comes next. It forces a song proc and it has a short cooldown, meaning we can usually use it twice during Wanderers and mages. Sidewinder gets stronger depending on how many dots your target has. Simply put, you always want to use it when you have your 2 dots on your target. Shadow Bite is just the AoE version of Sidewinder, and its damage only depends on how many dots the main target has, not the surrounding enemies. Raging Strikes is a straightforward 10% damage buff that lasts for 20 seconds that we generally want to use inside Wanderer's Minuet to buff Pitch Perfect. But here's the big one. Barrage will turn our next single target GCD into a triple cast, so that makes it Bard's strongest ability. It's like the biggest part of our burst in one button. It forces a straight shot ready proc for Refulgent, which is always what we want to use after Barrage, since it will not work with AoE GCDs or any kind of oGCD, so that means no Barraging Apex or Pitch Perfect. We pretty much always want to have Barrage inside Raging Strikes. And finally, we have Battle Voice. It's a powerful raid buff that increases the party's direct hit rate by 20% for 20 seconds. But here's the catch. The buff only affects allies and does nothing for you, so coordinate with your group to get the best out of it. So that's about it for the priority system for oGCDs. Now we'll go over the utility skills real quick, and then we can talk about the opener and the general rotation. For the utility oGCDs, we have Troubadour, which is very useful if not mandatory to mitigate and survive raid-wide, especially early in the prog. We have Nature's Mean, which increases the healing an ally takes by 20%. This is especially useful when you want to help your healers get a tank topped up or when a scholar wants to spread their shield. We have the Warden's Peons, which is very situational and can cleanse debuffs that are highlighted by a white bar. Next we have Second Wind, which is a decent pinch self-healing tool if you know you are missing a bit of HP to survive mechanic. And finally we have Arm's Length, which nullifies some pulls or knockback effects, which makes some mechanics easier to deal with. The rest of the utility skills are either very niche or mostly useless, but feel free to use them if you find the opportunity to. Alright, so this is the opener. There is a slight variation that comes into play when you get a Refulgent proc on your third boss shot, and if you do, you just have to push Barrage back 1 GCD. This opener should be able to catch every kind of raid buff timing your priority might have, so if you're in doubt, you can simply copy this opener. This opener is optimized for 2.46 GCD in mind, which is what the best in slot set uses, so some of the explanation might not be completely true for the other GCD tiers, but the general rules still apply and there won't be much of a difference in practice. We start off by popping our potion about 1.5 seconds before the pull, and immediately start by applying Stormbite, which is the stronger dot. If you happen to get a Refulgent proc after Stormbite, just ignore it. It's worth the risk of wasting this one because we want both of our dots up as soon as possible. Next we weave Bloodletter first, then Raging Strike second, in that order. There are 2 reasons for that. One is that using Bloodletter early before Wanderer's Minuet ensures that, by the end of Wanderers, you'll be able to use Bloodletter and put it on CD right before going into Mage's Ballad. And the other reason is that we want to have 9 GCDs under Raging Strikes, and the only way we can do this is by weaving Raging Strikes as late as possible in your GCD, about 2/3 of the way in. The timing is a bit tight, so it's okay if you don't get it right away. The next GCD is Caustic Bite, so now we have both of our dots up and running, and we can weave our strongest song, which is Wanderers, followed by Battle Voice. It's 20 seconds long, so it's used earlier than most of the raid buffs without missing any important big hits from your party. But if you know you have a party that has a late burst with strong cooldowns that would otherwise fall outside of Battle Voice, feel free to delay it accordingly. Now we use 3 filler GCDs in a row, which can be either Burst Shot or Refulgent Arrow, while we wait for all the raid buffs to go up. That's because most of our burst is loaded into Barrage, and we absolutely want it to be inside all the raid buffs. Now, if you happen to have 3 stacks of Pitch Perfect at any point before Imperial Arrow, you should prioritize using Pitch Perfect to avoid overcapping. And generally speaking, from this point onwards, you should prioritize weaving Pitch Perfect at 3 stacks over the other OGCDs, even if it means pushing them back 1 GCD. It's really not a big deal. Then after your third filler burst shot or Refulgent, weave Barrage, then use the Barrage Refulgent, then weave Sidewinder. If your third filler GCD was a burst shot and you got a Refulgent proc, make sure to use Refulgent before weaving Barrage to avoid overwriting your proc, then double weave Sidewinder with it. Continue with 2 filler GCDs and weave Bloodletter as soon as it's off cooldown. The first raid buffs should be about to fall off right about now. Snapshot all the buffs with Iron Jaws before they do, so you have super buffed dots that will last for the next 30 seconds. Imperial should also come off cooldown after Iron Jaws too. And that's about it for the opener. From there, you essentially follow the priority system and you should be set for the most part. Now let's talk about the song cycle itself. We follow an 80 second song cycle, despite each of our songs being 30 seconds long, and the main reason for that is our Mispayon is just so bad we want to spend the least amount of time possible in it without compromising our song cycle. Our song's base cooldown, as well as Raging Strikes and Barrage, all have an 80 second cooldown. In practice, this means using Wanderer's Minuet for 30 seconds, followed by Mage's Ballad for 30 seconds, and then Army's Paean that we cut short at 20 seconds before going back into Wanderer's Minuet. Remember that aside from the opener, we want to use Raging Strikes after Wanderers and not before it. And finally, I'll give you some general tips to help you focus on improving your gameplay. Avoid using macros. This one is true for pretty much every combat job in the game. When you use actions, the game queues them so your next action comes out as soon as possible. The game cannot queue macros though, so if you're macroing your GCDs, there will always be a delay before the game accepts your input, which will lead to a major DPS loss over time. I definitely do not recommend macroing your oGCDs either. The only macros I would consider acceptable on board would be mouse over or target macros for utility actions such as Nature's Mean or the Warden's Paean, because they are situational oGCDs and targeting an ally manually in combat can be a pain. Rearrange your HUD. It can be hard to keep track of your dot timers, the boss debuffs, your on buffs, your hotbars, and the fight mechanics. So don't be like me, and try to rearrange your HUD in a way that's easier for you to focus around one area of the screen. I will be linking HUD examples below in the description for both mouse and keyboard as well as gamepad. Dungeon pools. Although most of this guide has been more focused on single target situations, Bard really shines when it deals with big packs of mobs. Bard's AoE is crazy with Apex and Mage's Ballad. So what you want to do is pop either Wanderers or Armies and apply dots to several targets while the tank is running until they stop to burn the pack down with mages. Giving accurate numbers is hard when it comes to dealing with trash pools, but generally speaking, having anywhere from 6 to 8 active dots should be enough depending on the size of the pack and how long the mobs are going to live. Use Apex at 85 gauge or more, and remember to double dot at least one enemy for Shadow Bite as well. And then, smart practice. Make sure you're comfortable practicing the opener first at Stone Sky Sea. Being able to reset your cooldowns at will when you mess up goes a long way in learning the opener faster. Then move on to practicing your priority system while going through your song cycle on a housing or open world dummy for like 5 or 10 minutes, multiple times, so that you get familiar with the quirks of the rotation on the long run and practice your fundamentals. Then pick any normal difficulty fight, it can be a trial or a raid, it doesn't matter, and learn how to deal with simple mechanics while maintaining your rotation. Learn how downtime affects your song cycle, and try to adjust and experiment to see how everything fits together. You can also try to actively use your utility. And then when you feel confident enough, hop into an extreme trial where stakes are higher, or a savage fight if you're brave enough, and repeat the process. Try to observe how your cooldowns line up with raid buffs and other party members' cooldowns. This will force yourself to focus, have a better understanding of the game, and gain even more confidence. And that's it for the guide. There are many countless optimizations you can do on Bard to maximize your DPS, with very few fast and hard rules thanks to its flexible nature with no static rotation. But most of them come with lots and lots of practice, so just keep at it. There's a lot of depth to the job that I can't possibly cover in a single video, but I do invite you to give the Balances Bard guide a read, and probably more than one read if you're really interested in all the nooks and crannies of the job, and hop over to the Balance Discord to ask questions not covered in this video or in the text guide. I link the Discord and the text guide in the description down below. So yeah, thanks for watching this guide. It's my first attempt at making this kind of content, so I would really appreciate it if you could leave some feedback in the comments. I do plan on making more FF14 content in the future, mostly for the PvE side of things in Endwalker, whether there are guides or fights, about specific optimization videos, or my thoughts about the game in general. So stay tuned, I'll see you next time.